Mr. Abebe Selassie, thank you very much for speaking with Channels Television. Now, what would you consider as the main issue for sub-Saharan Africa in this new report?
So sub-Saharan Africa's economy is going through a bit of a rough patch at the moment. Economic growth slowed to around 1.5% last year from the 5.5–6% levels that the region had been enjoying for the last 10–15 years. And this year we're expecting a bit of a recovery to around 2.5%, but this is all still very anemic growth rates for a region with tremendous potential like sub-Saharan Africa. So we highlight this slowdown, welcome this recovery, but note that this is still way below what the region needs, and also lay out some of the policy requirements that are needed to foster growth and ensure that the region continues to grow at a much more rapid pace than it has in recent years.
No, but what recommendations are contained in that report to mitigate some of the challenges that are highlighted in the report?
Okay, so look, sub-Saharan Africa is a region of tremendous heterogeneity, tremendous variation. So, you have to do policy advice is country specific. But to the extent we can generalize, we see two broad areas, two broad groupings of challenges, shall we say. First is kind of the countries, commodity exporting countries like Nigeria, Angola, that have been hit very, very hard by the decline in commodity prices. It's now 2.5, almost 3 years since the decline in commodity prices, and what we're seeing is insufficient adjustment, inadequate adjustment to the impact of the commodity price decline. So in those countries, really the priority is to make sure that policies and reforms are undertaken to make sure that recovery goes forward. And we're seeing uncertainty about the direction of policies being the main hindrance to a recovery in growth. So addressing that has to be the focus of policies. But there are quite a lot of countries in the region which continue to grow at a rapid pace. I mean, the likes of Tanzania, Kenya, Ethiopia, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal are all growing at 6% or more. In those countries which are growing rapidly, what we are seeing is public debt levels beginning to increase despite high growth. So to those countries, we're saying, look, from a position of strength that you are right now, you really need to begin mobilizing more revenues so as to contain the increase in debt. You shouldn't be growing rapidly and also seeing a widening of your fiscal deficits, and that needs to be contained. So in those cases, it's more about avoiding more vulnerabilities going forward.
Speak to us specifically about Nigeria.
So in Nigeria, growth, of course, after last year's recession, we are expecting a recovery this year to about 0.8%. But that is really anemic. I mean, for a country like Nigeria, it should be growing at 6–7%. And indeed, as the government notes in the ERGP, that's a level of growth that's required to create the millions of jobs that this economy needs, to alleviate more people from poverty. So really the question is, how do we get the Nigeria economy to be the vibrant economy that we all know it can and will eventually be? Our sense right now is that one of the binding constraints for growth, for more vibrant growth, is really the macroeconomic policy environment. We see a need for reducing the macroeconomic imbalances in the economy. So the government has lost a big source of income, of course, with the decline in oil prices. New ways of replacing, new tax handles have to be found to replace that lost revenue source. And this is necessary because without more revenues, the government's not going to be able to invest more in infrastructure, health, education. So addressing that really is a big priority. Related to that, of course, are the number of structural reforms that this economy needs and are identified in the ERGP. Electricity production, making sure that you invest more in health, higher levels of education. And these, of course, are necessary in the long run to foster the growth that Nigeria needs. It goes without saying that without energy, a stable source of energy, you cannot have any kind of manufacturing activity or any of the economic diversification that you need. Also, of course, important at this juncture is making sure that you have a unified exchange rate, deep, liquid foreign exchange market, which will allocate foreign exchange on a more efficient and transparent basis. So we see, reforms in this area being really very important to lay the basis for Nigeria to grow at the 5–6% or more that it needs to.
How worried are you at the IMF about the recession and economic slowdown in major African economies, South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, and a bit of softening in Kenya as well.
Okay, so again, to reiterate, I think, the region is very, very diverse, and the challenges in each country are very different. So we are, of course, very worried about the largest economies in the region, Nigeria, Angola, South Africa, growing as slow as they are right now, and also, particularly in the case of Angola and Nigeria, facing significant macroeconomic imbalances. I mean, we need these three economies to be growing, rapidly for the regional output to be where it needs to be. So, it's an issue of concern. We're somewhat relieved that growth has started to pick up, but a lot more needs to be done in Nigeria and Angola, particularly in the macroeconomic environment as I laid out. The other countries, it's more kind of fine-tuning policies. The countries that are growing rapidly, the ones you mentioned, like Kenya, Tanzania, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, there it's really a bit more about fine-tuning policies to make sure that they avoid slowing down, or worse still, seeing an unsustainable debt build-up. So it's making sure that you adjust policies there. In Ghana, they already were hit by of course, macroeconomic imbalances a couple of years ago, and have been looking
for support. So it looks like this is spreading across the West Coast. Do you think this is a source of worry at any point in time?
I think the situation in each of the countries that you mentioned is a bit different. What has, in the case of Cameroon, of course, it is in the CEMAC region. 5 of the 6 countries in the CEMAC Monetary Union are oil exporters, and they too have been hit very much by the decline in commodity prices. So those countries are moving towards, or have requested and, for IMF support for their program. So it's in that context that we're supporting them. But, again, going back a little bit to the question that you raised earlier about, having a healthy Nigeria, Angola, South Africa for the region, it is partly also, of course, because of the spillovers that these countries have on the rest of the region, right? I mean, without these 3 large economies doing well, their neighbors, but even the broader region cannot do well, and there can be adverse spillovers. So this again is another reason why getting growth going back again here in these countries is going to be important.
Well, in terms of outlook, this report speaks of the fact that, yes, commodity prices are rebounding, as we've seen towards the end of last year. But the report says, well, it's not strong enough to get sub-Saharan Africa back on track where perhaps the IMF would want to see it. So where does that leave the SSA if the commodities rebound is not good enough? What should they do beyond oil? Beyond commodity prices? Okay,
so a couple of things here. First and foremost, commodity is an important story. I mean, oil or hard metals is really a very important story in about 15 out of, say, the 45 sub-Saharan African countries. Yeah? In much of the rest of the region, the exports are much more diversified and so have not been impacted directly by commodity prices. So, the travails of commodity prices really are impacting these 15 countries for the most part. The other countries, it tends to affect more negatively, because when commodity prices are high, those are affected negatively. So sub-Saharan Africa is not a commodity story. The whole of sub-Saharan Africa is not a commodity story. That's the first point. Second, even in the commodity exporting countries, the whole point is to avoid being so reliant on commodity prices, right? So the idea is to have more diversified economies. So even if it were the case that commodity prices were to recover, you definitely don't want to be focusing economic policies in that direction or relying that excessively. In any event, commodity prices going forward are not expected to recover. All projections show basically, for example, oil prices staying at their current levels in the $50 range going forward. So it's not something which can be seen as a driver of these economies or something that will give breathing space to do more reforms going forward. So really, I think, we all have to work on the basis that, going forward, if commodity prices that rise, that's well and good, but really we have to assume very prudent and conservative price levels going forward and do reforms accordingly.
In terms of growth generally across the region, to wrap up this conversation, what are the figures you're looking at in the medium to long term? Of course, the short-term projections are out, 2017, 2018, but if we're moving around a 4-year, 5-year period, what's the outlook from the IMF?
Okay, so, much will depend really on the steps, the policies that are taken in this period now. That's what's going to be laying the basis for growth recovering to the 5-6% range that the region has. We are projecting, growth, as I said, last year was only 1.5%. It's coming up to around 2.5% and going up to just over 3% next year. And really, depending on whether countries, address the challenges that they're facing on the macro area, particularly in countries like Nigeria, we see, we're expecting that the, ARGP will be implemented to the fullest extent, laying the basis for stronger growth. So we should, over the medium term, see a recovery in growth. Certainly, as I started out saying, this is a region of tremendous potential, and there's no reason why the region shouldn't. Most countries in the region should be growing at 5-6% or more. The key really is to find out in each case what the binding constraint, what is preventing growth being of that order, and addressing it. And as I said, in the commodity exporters, we see that macro policy environment not being appropriate, being one of the important binding constraints. Addressing that will be key for the recovery in growth that we need.
Abebe Selassie, well, thank you very much for speaking with us on Channels Television.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. I hope you had a good stay in Nigeria.
Thank you.